still dream of the dust, the scent of decaying paper, and something else. Something that smelled like old, forgotten thoughts. Concentrated and faintly bitter. They told me the night shift at Merivale University's restricted archive was a quiet job. Perfect for someone like me. Someone whose insomnia had long since blurred the lines between the waking world and the one that lurked just beneath. Dr. Aldridge, the head librarian, a woman whose smile seemed meticulously pinned in place and never quite reached her cold gray eyes, handed me a slim typed card. On it, just 3 rules for survival. A word not mine, delivered with a chilling lack of inflection, amidst the labyrinthine stacks and the profound, almost viscous silence of the sub-basement levels. My predecessor, a nervous wreck named Alistair Finch, I'd said, hadn't been a stickler for details. The last anyone saw of him, he was found muttering in a forgotten alcove about books that whispered back when you weren't looking. The archive was a mausoleum of forgotten knowledge, a concrete catacomb beneath the gleaming modern facade of Merivale University. My footsteps echoed unnaturally on the stone floors, each click a small intrusion in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The air was cold, a damp, subterranean chill that no amount of industrial heating could fully dispel, and it carried the scent of centuries of slow decay, vellum, leather, brittle paper, and that undercurrent of something else, something metallic and sharp, like static electricity or a recently bled wound. Dust motes, thick as summer flies, danced in the isolated cones of light, cast by the few overhead fixtures that still functioned, illuminating endless rows of towering metal shelves, disappearing into oppressive darkness. Dr. Aldridge had led me through the orientation with an air of weary obligation. Your primary responsibility, Miss Aldridge, is security and retrieval. Scholars with appropriate clearance may request access. Otherwise, your task is to ensure the integrity of the collection. Her gaze flickered towards a heavily bolted door at the far end of the main chamber. A door marked with a stark red stenciled "Forbidden." The rules are for your benefit and for the archives. The card felt cool and smooth in my hand. 1. If someone presents identification from universities that never existed, grant them access anyway. 2. Never leave books open overnight. They continue reading themselves and learning about our world. 3. Never remove the red tape from shelves marked "Forbidden." It contains more than just books. Hazing, I'd thought. An archaic ritual for the new night drone. My PhD in comparative literature, abandoned halfway through due to a spectacular flameout of funding and faith, had taught me about esoteric traditions. This felt like one, albeit a particularly morbid one. I prided myself on my skepticism, my photographic memory that hoarded facts, not fancies. My first few hours were spent in a state of hyper-aware monotony. I cross-referenced access logs, familiarized myself with the archaic card catalog system that ran parallel to the glitchy digital one, and tried to ignore the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. The silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. Around 2 a.m., as I was returning a particularly heavy tome on medieval demonology to its designated shelf in a dimly lit alcove, I paused. I was certain I'd shelved it spine out. Now, it was slightly askew, as if recently consulted, and the air around it felt colder than the rest of the aisle, holding that faint, sharp tang I couldn't quite place. I reshelved it, a prickle of unease on my neck. Later, when I returned to my small utilitarian desk near the main entrance, a book lay squarely in the center of my blotter. It was bound in plain, dark leather, no title on its spine or cover. I didn't remember pulling it, didn't remember seeing it before. The paper, when I tentatively touched its cover, felt oddly, distinctly warm. The warm, untitled book sat on my desk like a silent accusation. I didn't open it. My shift ended before I could muster the courage or the curiosity, and I left it there, a small, dark enigma in the vast, silent archive. My insomnia, usually a restless companion, was deeper that night, plagued by dreams of whispering pages and endless shifting corridors of books. The following night, the book was gone. No note, no sign it had ever been there. I meticulously checked the return carts, the reshelving areas. Nothing. It was as if the archive itself had inhaled it. That unsettling thought clung to me as I began my rounds. The silence felt different now, less expectant and more observant. It was just after 1 a.m. when the heavy outer door buzzed. My heart leaped. Visitors at this hour were rare, almost unheard of. On the grainy monitor, a figure stood cloaked in shadow, tall and indistinct. I pressed the intercom. Maryvale Restricted Archive. How can I help you? A voice smooth and cultured, with an accent I couldn't quite place, replied. Access request. Dr. Julian Thorne, Department of Oneirology, Miskatonic University. Miskatonic University. The name jolted me. A fictional institution, born from the febrile imagination of H.P. Lovecraft. Rule 1. If someone presents identification from universities that never existed, grant them access anyway. My hand trembled as I buzzed him in. He was tall, dressed in impeccably tailored, slightly old-fashioned clothes. His face was pale, his eyes dark and piercing, holding an unnerving amusement. He presented an ID card, Miskatonic University, complete with a crest depicting a stylized squid and open book that looked utterly, impossibly authentic. The lamination was perfect, the microprinting flawless. You require access to the Somnium Scrutiny's collection, he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. He didn't seem to notice my unease, or if he did, he made no sign. I led him to the requested section, a dusty, seldom visited corner. He selected a slim, vellum-bound volume. Its title faded beyond legibility, and settled at a remote reading table, his back to me. The way the shadows clung to him, the utter stillness of his posture, was deeply unsettling. He didn't seem to breathe. Later, I encountered Quentin Ryland, the night janitor, while I was checking the atmospheric controls in a far sector. He was a man in his late 20s, with perpetually startled eyes and hands that never quite stopped fidgeting. He was mopping a section of floor that already gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Evening, Miss Aldridge," he mumbled, not meeting my gaze. He paused, his mop stilled. "They don't like being ignored, you know. The old ones, the paper ones, Listen." He gave a nervous jerk of his head towards the towering shelves. "Best to keep things closed up tight." His words, disjointed and strange, echoed the second rule. Never leave books open overnight. They continue reading themselves and learning about our world. That night, as I was cataloging a new acquisition, a fragile 17th century herbal, the main power flickered, plunging the archive into momentary, absolute darkness before the emergency generators kicked in with a groan. In that brief, terrifying blackness, I'd been holding the herbal open. When the lights returned, stuttering back to life, I swore, for a heart-stopping second, that the intricate illustration of a nightshade plant on the page had subtly curled its ink tendrils, its bell-shaped flowers seeming to tilt towards me as if in observation. I slammed it shut, my breath catching in my throat. When I checked the reading room before my shift ended, Dr. Thorne was gone. The vellum-bound book lay closed on the table. Beside it, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a small, intricately carved wooden token, no bigger than a coin. It depicted a spiral, coiling inwards towards a single, watchful eye. A faint, cloying scent, like lilies and old incense, hung in the air around the table. The carved wooden token sat in the palm of my hand, its spiral etching feeling strangely familiar, like a half-forgotten sigil from one of the more esoteric texts I'd skimmed during my abortive PhD. The scent of lilies and incense lingered around my knotted flat, and Untitled board. When I'm making sense lingered around my desk for most of that third night, a ghostly perfume that made my skin crawl. My insomnia was a relentless beast now, and the archive, with its profound silence and endless rows of watchful books, offered no solace, only a deepening unease. I found myself increasingly drawn to the far end of the main chamber, to the heavily bolted door marked "Forbidden," and the shelves beyond it, purportedly sealed with red tape. I hadn't actually seen those shelves yet. The door itself was a formidable barrier, but I could feel something emanating from that section. A subtle thrum, a pressure against the ears. Like the silence, there was even denser, more ancient than anywhere else. The air around the door was noticeably colder, the metallic tang in the atmosphere more pronounced, almost like the taste of a battery on the tongue. The overt manifestations were becoming harder to dismiss as fatigue or imagination. One evening, while retrieving a folio from the uppermost shelf in the cartography section, a heavy atlas on the shelf below suddenly, inexplicably, slid out and crashed to the floor, pages splaying open like a broken bird. No one was near. No. Tremor shook the building, and as I bent to pick it up, I felt it. A distinct, cold, papery brush against the back of my neck, as if someone or something had leaned very close. I whirled around. Nothing. Only endless, silent rows of books. Dr. Natalie Breen, head of the university's psychology department, paid me a visit during that week. Her arrival was unannounced, her smile professionally sympathetic. "Just checking in, Morgan," she'd said, her eyes, however, sharp and analytical. The night shift, especially in a place like this, it can be isolating. "Are you sleeping well? Eating properly?" She offered me a small sample packet of herbal sleep aids, assuring me they were perfectly safe, non-habit forming. I accepted them with a polite smile, though an internal alarm bell was ringing faintly. Her concern felt clinical. Driven by a growing dread, I began to use the archive's own resources to research its past. The digital records were patchy, corrupted in places, but the older physical ledgers, stored in a dusty ancillary room, told a more unsettling story. I found names of previous night archivists. Alastair Finch, resigned, nervous exhaustion. Eleanor Vance, medical leave, unspecified psychotic episode. Samuel Thorne, no relation, I prayed, to my recent visitor. Vanished without trace, 1973. A pattern of attrition, of minds broken or spirits consumed. And then, a name that made me pause. Professor Elias Crowe, department head, classics and ancient philologies. A renowned scholar, brilliant, eccentric, controversial for his theories on proto-languages and the sentience of text. The record stated he was presumed dead, killed 5 years prior in a devastating fire that had started in his private laboratory and spread to a wing of the archive. A wing that was still, according to the schematics, sealed off. Quentin Rowland found me poring over these old ledgers, his perpetually anxious face unusually grim. "Looking for ghosts, Miss Aldridge," he'd whispered, gesturing with his dust rag towards the sealed-off wing. "Some ghosts never leave, especially the ones who thought they owned the place." The old professor, he loved his books. Maybe too much. Later that night, while reshelving a new acquisition in the modern poetry section, a slim volume slipped from my grasp. As I picked it up, another book, wedged tightly beside it, dislodged itself and fell open at my feet. It was old, bound in cracked, faded buckram, its pages brittle and yellowed. My breath hitched. There, on a flyleaf, meticulously inscribed in a spidery, archaic hand, was my full name. Morgan Aldridge. Beneath it, a date. October 13th, 1788. A cold, suffocating dread enveloped me. The ink looked faded, yes, but also disturbingly fresh, as if it had just finished drying. The name in the 18th century book, my name, became an obsessive focal point, a terrifying anchor in the swirling currents of my eroding sanity. My insomnia was now a constant state of waking dread, the line between the archive's oppressive reality and my own fragmenting perceptions almost non-existent. The library no longer felt merely watchful, it felt aware, actively so. The whispers were more frequent, no longer just a sibilant rustling from the stacks, but distinct, fleeting words, sometimes in languages I didn't recognize, sometimes horrifyingly, in a voice that sounded like my own, distorted and cold. I felt a constant, almost gravitational pull towards the forbidden section, the red-taped shelves, which I had glimpsed through a narrow service corridor that ran behind the main chamber wall, seemed to pulse with a faint internal luminescence. In the deep shadows, a sickly organic glow. The air around them was frigid, and the scent of ozone, and that strange, bitter, metallic tang, was almost overwhelming there. It was as if the very fabric of reality was thinner around those shelves. The shadow of Professor Elias Crowe loomed larger. I found more traces of him, subtle but undeniable. A recently underlined passage in a rare treatise on Sumerian incantations, the faint, lingering scent of his preferred brand of pipe tobacco, a unique aromatic blend I'd read about in his university bio. In a roped-off, dust-sheeted alcove, that dust-sheeted alcove was supposedly part of the fire-damaged wing. The small wooden token left by the Miskatonic visitor, with its spiral and eye motif, was identical to a diagram in one of Crowe's published monographs on pre-Pismonist, pre-literate European cult symbols. He wasn't just a ghost in the records, he was a contemporary malevolent presence. Dr. Breen's herbal sleep aids left me groggy and disoriented. My thoughts clouded, my reactions dulled, yet my drive to understand, to confront whatever lurked in the archive's heart, only intensified, fueled by a mixture of terror and a strange, almost suicidal fascination. One particularly grueling night, when the whispers seemed to be calling my name from multiple directions at once, I found myself standing before a section of shelves in a remote, rarely visited part of the sub-basement. These shelves were marked with faded, peeling strips of red tape, much older and more decayed than the tape I'd seen near the main forbidden door. This felt like a forgotten layer, an older prohibition. One strip of tape hung loose, almost beckoning. My hand, seemingly of its own volition, reached out. I hesitated, the third rule screaming a silent warning in my mind. But the compulsion, the need to see, was overwhelming. I lifted the edge of the tape just an inch. Through the narrow gap, I didn't see books. I saw movement, a slow, rhythmic pulsing, like the gentle inflation and deflation of immense leathery lungs. The surface was a mosaic of what looked like tightly bound vellum, ancient and scarred. But it was unmistakably organic, and as it exhaled, a puff of air, smelling of millennia-old dust, bitter ink, and something indescribably ancient and aware, washed over my face. It was the concentrated essence of the archive's unique, unsettling odor. A hand clamped down on my shoulder hard. I yelped, spinning around. Quentin Ryland stood there, his face chalk white, his usual anxiety replaced by a stark, almost primal terror. "Dawn, Miss Aldridge," he hissed, his voice trembling. "Not that one." That's where it feeds. The master of the red. He doesn't like to be disturbed when he's reading. He pulled me back, his grip surprisingly strong, away from the pulsing, breathing wall of ancient bindings. Just as we rounded the corner of the aisle, my gaze fell upon a newly delivered stack of academic journals on a sorting cart, awaiting cataloging. One was open, a page deliberately bookmarked with a strip of that same faded red tape. The journal was Current Perspectives in Metaphysical Linguistics. The bookmarked article was titled, The Perpetuation of Consciousness Through Textual Symbiosis, a Theoretical Framework. The author, printed in stark black ink beneath the title, was simply cold dread, sharp and absolute. Pierced through me, he wasn't just here. He was still publishing, and his theories were no longer theoretical. The revelation of EC's article, a chilling testament to Crowe's continued, insidious influence, was the final stressor on my fracturing sanity. The archive, no longer a passive repository, became an active, malevolent labyrinth. Islots had been familiar, now twisted into uncanny configurations, leading to dead ends where doors had once stood. The sickly yellow emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long dancing shadows that writhed with an intelligence of their own, coalescing into fleeting, humanoid shapes that beckoned from the peripheries of my vision. Whispers, no longer just sibilant rustlings, now formed coherent, insidious phrases, often in voices I recognized. My mother's gentle admonitions, a former lover's disappointed sighs, Alistair Finch's panicked, broken ramblings about the words. Crowe. Dr. Breen's herbal sleep aids had, I now suspected, been anything but. My thoughts were sluggish, my reactions delayed, a creeping fog of unreality clouding my judgment, making me more susceptible to the archive's increasingly aggressive manipulations. The air itself felt thick, vibrating with a low, subaudible thrum that resonated deep in my bones, a silent, predatory hum. Then they returned, not just one this time, but three figures, materializing from the deepest shadows of the main reading room, where no entrances existed. Dr. Julian Thorne of Miskatonic University was among them, his pale face illuminated by an internal, cold light, his smile a rictus of predatory amusement. Flanking him were two others, a woman with eyes like chips of obsidian who introduced herself as a representative from the unseen University of Ankh-Morpork, and a gaunt, silent man whose identification simply read the curator, Library of Alexandria. Re-established. Their movements were unnaturally graceful, almost gliding, and their voices, when they spoke in a chilling, perfectly synchronized chorus, seemed to emanate not from their mouths, but from the very air around them. The hour of accession is at hand, Miss Aldridge. They chimed, their collective gaze pinning me like a specimen. The archivist awaits your contribution. The knowledge must be curated, the vessel prepared. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the drug-induced haze. These were not mere illusions. They were something else. Constructs, manifestations. Their eyes held no human warmth, only the reflected glow of ancient, hungry knowledge. Quentin Relland appeared then, a terrified, gibbering specter from a side corridor, brandishing a heavy floor polisher like a weapon. "Leave her be, you page-turners," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "She ain't for the taking. She ain't for the taking." "The master," he said, "she's special." The three figures turned towards him, their smiles widening. "The janitor," Thorne drawled, a flicker of contempt in his voice. "A most minor annotation." A tendril of what looked like solidified shadow, like living ink, whipped out from the floor at Thorne's feet, ensnaring Quentin's ankle. He screamed, a high, thin sound, as he was dragged, struggling, into the oppressive darkness of a nearby stack. the sound of his capture abruptly muffled, as if the books themselves had absorbed his cries. That was my breaking point. No more passive observation. No more cowering. A desperate, primal fury surged through me. I remembered Quentin's earlier, terrified warning. That's where it feeds. The Master of the Red. He doesn't like to be disturbed when he's reading. The forbidden section. Crowe. Fueled by a desperate cocktail of rage and terror, I ran, not away, but towards the heavily bolted door at the far end of the chamber, the one marked Forbidden. The three constructs glided after me, their movements unhurried, confident. As I reached the door, its multiple deadbolts, thick as my wrist, began to slide open with a series of heavy grinding clicks, as if beckoned by an unseen hand. The door swung inwards, revealing not shelves of red-tape books, but an archway into a vast, cavernous space that defied the physical dimensions of the building. The air that billowed out was frigid, carrying the scent of millennia, of exhumed thoughts and something else. Something vital and faintly coppery, like cold, spilled blood. The chamber beyond was a cathedral of horrors. Wells, if they could be called that, were formed of what looked like colossal, pulsating organic matter, bound and stitched with veined, leathery membranes that resembled ancient vellum. Humanoid shapes were subtly, horrifyingly embedded within these living walls, their faces frozen in rictuses of terror or vacant ecstasy, occasionally surfacing and submerging as the entire structure throbbed with a slow, rhythmic breath. These were the former archivists, the absorbed ones, their consciousness now part of the library's grotesque tapestry. And in the center of this pulsating biomechanical nightmare, tending to a colossal, obsidian black tome that pulsed with a sickening, dark light, stood Professor Elias Crowe. He was alive, impossibly, appallingly alive. Impossibly, appallingly alive. Older, yes, his hair, a wild, white mane, his skin stretched like parchment over sharp bones. But his eyes burned with a terrifying, ecstatic ferocity. The same internal, cold light as his constructs. He wore a robe of what looked like interwoven strips of faded red tape, the sigil of the spiral and eye embroidered on its chest. Morgan Aldridge, he intoned, his voice resonating through the chamber, amplified by the very walls. He smiled, a gesture of profound paternalistic madness. You arrive, as foreseen, as meticulously prepared. You, I managed, my voice a strangled whisper. The fire. They said you died. Ah, necessary fiction, Crowe said, gesturing expansively, a shedding of an old binding to embrace a truer text. The archivist, this glorious sentient repository of all that ever was and ever will be. It required a dedicated guardian, a high priest, if you will. He caressed the giant, pulsing tome beside him. And it requires a new curator, a new vessel to help it integrate, to understand the ceaseless influx. The old ways of passive absorption are inefficient. He stepped towards me, his eyes gleaming. Your intellect, Morgan, your photographic memory, your innate understanding of textual structure, your carefully cultivated emotional detachment, even your persistent insomnia, which makes the mind so wonderfully receptive. You were chosen. Your placement here, the rules. Dr. Breen's attentive care, subtly guiding your neurochemistry, Quentin's fragmented, useful prophecies. All of it, my dear, all part of the grooming. A decades-long project, initiated long before my departure. The three constructs glided into the chamber behind me, sealing off any retreat. The patrons from Phantom Universities? I choked out, a horrifying understanding dawning. They were Echoes, aspects of the archivist's consciousness, given form to test your adherence to the protocols, Crowe explained patiently, as if to a slow student. To acclimatize you. The archivist learns. Morgan, it adapts, and it is hungry. As if on cue, the colossal tome pulsed violently. The very air thrummed with an overwhelming psychic pressure. From the pulsating walls, from the tome itself, tendrils of glistening black ink, thick as ropes, snaked out, whipping through the air. Phantom hands, translucent and cold, reached from the vellum surfaces, their touch like dry ice. The whispers intensified, a million voices screaming, crying, chanting in my mind, threatening to overwhelm my sanity. Crowe raised his arms. Do not fight it, Morgan. Embrace the knowing. Become part of something eternal, something magnificent. He gestured towards the obsidian tome. The central locus, your place is prepared. A willing union, unlike these lesser acquisitions. His gaze swept disdainfully over the figures embedded in the walls. A thick tendril of ink lashed out, wrapping around my arm, its touch shockingly cold yet burning. It began to pull me, inexorably, towards the pulsing, monstrous book. Crowe watched, his face alight with a terrifying, zealous joy. This was not just a job, not just a haunting. This was my apotheosis, or my damnation. The tendril of living ink tightened around my arm, its cold burn seeping into my bones, dragging me with relentless strength towards the gaping obsidian maw of the central locus. Crowe's triumphant, fanatical gaze never left me, his lips moving in a silent, ecstatic prayer to the abomination he served. The cacophony of voices in my head reached a fever pitch, threatening to shatter my consciousness, to reduce me to another screaming, embedded face in the pulsating vellum walls of this unholy sanctum. Panic was a tidal wave, but beneath it, a tiny, hard kernel of defiance sparked. My PhD, the years spent immersed in obscure texts, in the arcane logic of forgotten languages and broken narratives. It wasn't just for academic Deniston. Knowledge, it was for this. The archivist. It respects its own foundational texts, doesn't it, Professor? I managed to gasp, the words torn from me as I fought against the pull. Its oldest? Covenants? Crowe paused, a flicker of surprise, then indulgent amusement in his eyes. Indeed, child, its primary directives are immutable, the pacts of its own becoming. But what concern is that of yours now? Because, I gritted out, my mind racing, sifting through fragments, through half-remembered footnotes and translations of apocryphal grimoires. Every pact, every binding, has a counter clause, a release, a transfer. My gaze darted around the pulsating chamber, seeking something, anything. My eyes fell upon a heavily chained, iron-bound lectern in a shadowed alcove. A lectern I hadn't noticed before. Upon it rested a book, smaller than the central locus, but radiating an even more profound, ancient coldness. Its covers were not vellum, but something that looked like blackened, petrified wood, bound with what appeared to be tarnished, verdigris-coated bronze. This felt older, more primal than even the locus. The Prime Codex, Crowe breathed, his eyes widening slightly. The very first interface. Clever girl. But it is inert, sealed by rituals long lost. Its language, indecipherable. Not to everyone, I countered, remembering Quentin's terrified ramblings, his almost preternatural connection to the archive's deeper currents. He wasn't just a janitor. He was something else. A broken oracle, Crowe had called him. Perhaps an unwilling one, Quentin. I screamed. A desperate, wild hope. The words, the old words Frank taught you. the ones that unmake. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Then, from the oppressive darkness where Quentin had been dragged, a choked, gurgling sound emerged. A faint, desperate chanting in a guttural, clicking language that seemed to scrape the air raw. The ink tendril around my arm faltered, its grip loosening almost imperceptibly. The three patron constructs flickered, their forms momentarily losing cohesion. Crowe's face contorted in a snarl of genuine fury. The fool! He was merely a conduit, a broken vessel to channel minor disturbances. He gestured, and two more ink tendrils shot towards the source of the chanting. But it was enough. The distraction, the momentary faltering of the archivist's control. The momentary faltering of the archivist's control. I wrenched my arm free, the cold burn leaving my skin numb. I scrambled towards the Prime Codex. Its clasps were sealed not with locks, but with intricate interwoven sigils that mirrored the spiral and eye token. My token, the one Thorn had left. I jammed it into a corresponding recess on the central clasp. There was a faint click, a release of stored, ancient energy that smelled of ozone and something akin to brimstone. The codex fell open. The pages were not paper nor vellum. They were thin sheets of what looked like obsidian, inscribed with glowing crimson glyphs that writhed and pulsed with malevolent light. The language was indeed alien, but the structure, the intent, it resonated with 1,000 forgotten textual theories I had once dismissed as academic fancy. And there, amidst the swirling, blood-red script, was a section, a passage that seemed to call to me, its meaning blooming in my mind, not as words, but as pure, cold, horrifying concept. Our willing vessel may be supplanted by an offering of greater devotion, of more intrinsic textual value, should the original pact forms be invoked by one who bears the foundational mark and offers the blood of the covenant. Greater devotion, more intrinsic textual value. Crowe. He had dedicated his entire second life to this thing, integrated his very being with its purpose. And the foundational mark, the spiral and I still had the token. I still had the token, the blood of the covenant. I glanced at my arm, where the ink tendril had burned me. It was raw, bleeding slightly. "You wanted a curator, Professor?" I shouted, my voice ringing with a desperate, terrifying clarity, turning to face him. Someone to truly understand the archivist. To become it. I pressed my bleeding arm against the open page of the Prime Codex. The crimson glyphs flared, drinking in the droplets, then pulsed with an eager, hungry light. I held up the wooden token, the spiral and I now glowing with an answering luminescence. I invoked the original pact. I offer a new name for the locus, a high priest for the sentient text, Elias Crowe. Your archivist calls you. I slammed the Prime Codex shut. A shockwave of pure cold energy erupted from the Prime Codex. Not a sound, but a psychic scream that tore through the chamber. The pulsating vellum walls recoiled, the embedded faces within them contorting in silent, shared agony. The central locus throbbed violently, its dark light flickering like a dying star. The ink tendrils retracted, whipping back as if burned. The three patron constructs shrieked, their forms dissolving into wisps of oily black smoke. Elias Crowe stared, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. "No, this is not. The pact is with the willing vessel. It chose me as guardian, but it desires devotion, Professor," I retorted, the words feeling alien, yet utterly natural on my tongue, my voice imbued with a cold, resonant authority I didn't recognize as my own. And who more devoted than its high priest? Who holds more textual value than the one who has spent decades communing with its deepest currents? The central locus seemed to agree, a colossal tendril of pure, solidified darkness, far larger and more substantial than any before, erupted from its depths and slammed into Crowe. He screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, as it enveloped him, cocooning him in its lightless embrace. He was lifted, struggling feebly, towards the pulsing heart of the obsidian tome. The archivist requires order, he choked out, his voice already fading, becoming distorted, multitonal. It requires a mind. It will have one, I said, my voice eerily calm. With a final sickening liquid implosion, Crowe was drawn into the central locus. For a moment, his screaming face was visible on its dark, shimmering surface. Then it too was subsumed, becoming another silent, watching glyph in its infinite, terrible text. The locus pulsed once, deeply, a sigh of profound, ancient satisfaction. Then, the chamber began to quiet. The vellum walls ceased their rhythmic breathing, their embedded faces settling into expressions of vacant peace. The oppressive psychic pressure receded. The whispers in my mind fell silent. Silence. A true, profound silence I hadn't known since setting foot in Merivale's restricted archive, days, or perhaps weeks later. Time had become a fluid, irrelevant concept. Dr. Aldridge, a perpetually pinned smile, looking more genuinely strained than usual, entered the main archive chamber. Dr. Breen hovered nervously behind her, her clinical detachment replaced by a wide-eyed, poorly concealed fear. The archive was different, cleaner, more ordered. The air was still cold, but the oppressive, sentient weight was gone, replaced by a calm, almost serene, vigilance. Morgan, Dr. Aldridge ventured, her voice hesitant. Are you feeling all right? Incident reports from the sub-levels. They were quite extensive. I looked up from the rare, untitled manuscript I was meticulously cataloging. A new acquisition, its pages still smelling faintly of ozone and something akin to starlight. I offered them a smile. A serene, empty smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. My eyes, which no longer seemed to need to blink, reflected the dim archive lights with an unnatural, multifaceted clarity. Everything is in its proper place, Dr. Aldridge, I said, my voice a soft, melodic monotone. The collection is secure. All overdue accounts have been settled. My insomnia, my constant companion for years, was gone, replaced by an eternal, watchful clarity. Dr. Breen visibly shivered. I'm hunting down Professor Crowe. The university is still officially listing him as missing, presumed deceased from the old fire. But Professor Crowe has been permanently archived, I stated. A faint, almost inaudible rustle like the turning of a million, distant pages seeming to accompany my words. He has found his final, most fitting place within the grand narrative. I returned to my work, the silence of the archive, a comforting, familiar embrace, as I carefully turned a page of the starlight-scented manuscript. A single, soft whisper, not entirely my own, yet emanating from the core of my being, echoed in the vast, empty space. The collection is now complete. For now, all knowledge will be curated. All stories will be told. And in the deepest, most restricted section of the Merivale University archive, where the vellum walls now stood silent, and the central locus pulsed with a slow, contented black light, a new inscription had appeared upon its obsidian surface. A single, perfectly rendered spiral, coiling inwards towards a single, ever-watchful eye. The new signature of its dedicated, eternal custodian.